Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger potion. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to our latest Patreon bonus content episode for December 29th, 2022. I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
And there's Brendan Cassidy. Hello,
I just
everybody.
came right in. I just came right into that.
No, I
Sounded
love
like
it.
you were about to introduce me, but
Yeah,
I'm
you
going to
know-
introduce myself this time.
You know, Brendan should introduce himself with that lovely voice that he has there.
You're
we
too
always
kind.
love that. So, welcome everybody to this Patreon bonus content episode, doing this video style, which is very exciting. Unless there's a catastrophe, and this is going up as audio instead of video, which I'm trying not to think about too much.
I will take the fall for this one. I sort of
Yeah.
jinxed it before we started the recording process by asking if I should record on my own end in case something were to go wrong. So now something's going
It's
to go
in the
wrong.
ether, so inevitably the video will corrupt, and this will go out as audio. that's just how it's going to happen now. But
Hey, at least we have the backup then.
yeah, we do. But if by some miracle karma doesn't come after us and the video goes up, then welcome everybody.
Yeah.
We hope that you enjoy this little bonus content episode that we're doing. And this is going to be a really fun show. So if you're new to In Session Film, this is something that Brendan and I have done for years, really since the inception when we first launched In Session Film back in 2013. At the end of the year, leading up to the award show, we have these various top 3 lists that we would do. However, this year, there's been so many movies to review that we haven't had time to do a top 3 list in some time. So we're going to do them all right here on this episode, which is going to be a lot of fun.
Patreon bonus content has now become home to the gauntlet style conversation where we just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. We did a whole slew of movie reviews trying to do a catch up in preparation for the end of the year, and now we're more or less doing the same thing with these year-end top 3s. These are so much fun to do, JD, and we love including them on the main shows, but apparently Hollywood also likes to release high-profile films all at the end of the year.
Yeah.
So it's made it hard for us to really time it that way.
Absolutely. So the top 3 lists that we do each year leading up to the award show. So usually we start off with our top 3 against the grain movies, the movies that we typically liked more than most seem to, based either off the discourse or how they did critically, or in many cases both. But also, in addition to that one, we have our top 3 action scenes that we'll do.
Yeah.
And then we'll finish things off with our top 3 comedic scenes of the year, which is going to be a lot of fun. And then kind of continuing that next week on the main show, so episode 515, I believe that is,
Right.
we'll be doing our top 5 scenes of the year. So you'll want to make sure you stay tuned for that episode, as that's coming out very soon. But for this episode, top 3 against the grain, top 3 action, top 3 comedic scenes. That's what we'll be doing. Before we get into it, though, I do want to say a big thank you to our patrons. Your support really does mean the world to us. If you're listening to this after it is released to the public, welcome to you all as well. And if you want to support us at Patreon, that's patreon.com/InSessionFilm. And you get early access to all of these bonus content episodes, among other perks that we have available there at Patreon. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's do our top 3 against the grain movies. Again, these are the movies that we liked more than most based off of whatever criteria we set. I'm curious, Brendan, I do want to ask you this going in. What criteria maybe you looked at specifically.
Yeah.
And I know typically we tend to lean positive. Is that something you also stuck to this year, or was there something that just really stuck out to you on the other end of that coin?
I usually try to at least throw one film in here that I liked less than most people, but I chose not to do that this time around. I did choose to keep this 100% in the realm of positivity for this top 3. And I did that for a few reasons. The big one being that it was more of a challenge for me to find against the grain movies that I liked more than other people. I feel like there's a lot more there's a lot more in the realm of consensus picks when it comes to 2022. There are not many films that I feel like I liked a lot more than most people. So I'm sort of dubbing this my my top 3 against the discourse movies. And something tells me we're going to be, I don't want to say in lockstep, but I wouldn't be surprised if we have at least one, maybe even 2 movies on our respective top 3s that we share. Because this has been a year of heavy discourse, angry discourse for a lot of movies. And in many of those cases, I found myself liking these movies more than most of that angry discourse seemed to suggest. So I'm kind of using that as my primary basis for this one.
Yeah, I'm really with you in that criteria. I wanted to look at the discourse where the conversation sat, and then obviously where I'm at on that spectrum. That was really the main thing. I guess the only other thing I would add to it is that I also looked at Letterboxd just to kind of get a feel of what the conversation was there specifically. Because sometimes the conversation on Letterboxd and what you see on Twitter doesn't always correlate, or maybe there's a little bit of a disparity there.
Sure.
So I wanted to look at that as well, because, if there's something that's come out that I feel really good about, but, the conversation is, maybe it's mixed on Twitter, but then you go to Letterboxd and it's like 3.9 is the average, or 4 is the average. I'm like,
that is a very high rating for Letterboxd for listeners who don't know what Letterboxd is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did want to look at that as well, just to kind of have an extra bullet point there to kind of gauge, like, okay, where am I at against the grain with this movie? So that was kind of my mentality coming into this a little bit.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
All right, let's start with our number 3 then. What is your number 3 against the grain movie of 2022?
I will say I don't really have these ranked in a certain way. Right now I have them ranked in my feelings toward the actual film as far as which ones I like more than others, but in some ways I feel like I could rank them more heavily based on the heaviness of the discourse as opposed to how much I feel about the movie. So I'm kind of going by the former, how much I feel about the movie. So they're ranked by which ones I just like more than others. So right now, my number 3 is going to piss a lot of people off, and that's Andrew Dominik's Blonde.
Oh, boy. Here we go.
Which again, we talked about this not too long ago. We had this during a break segment of our review of The Whale, if I'm not mistaken. Another very controversial movie. Blonde, I feel like, is not all that successful in what it's attempting to do. In fact, I will say, Blonde, alongside another film on my list, I don't love these movies. I kind of understand the vitriol they've been receiving. But there are things that Dominik is doing that I at least found provocative, and they made me think. I think it at least raises this question about how gratuitous and heavy-handed you can be with a certain subject, and if that then has this like adverse effect on people. So in the case of someone like Marilyn Monroe in the movie Blonde, and treating it more about the mythology of Marilyn Monroe as opposed to the person, by being as gratuitous as it is, it sort of gives general audiences what they think they're supposed to expect, and being so heavy-handed with it, does that then make that audience think, maybe this is wrong? Maybe I shouldn't be thinking about it in this way. And I'm kind of wondering, is there a weird psychological agenda with this movie that we're just not talking about. And again, I don't know if that's the case. I'm not suggesting that that's what the movie is doing or even what Andrew Dominic is doing. But there was something about the movie I had some ounce of respect for. And I have it in my list mostly because of the heavy anger that it has received, which in many ways I do understand. But I'm kind of thinking the film was prepared for that. So I feel a weird urge to maybe not defend it, but at least give it the benefit of the doubt in some way. And I think there are some interesting things from a filmmaking standpoint that I don't want to overlook. So I will give the movie Blonde my number 3 slot here. I think there are some interesting things about it.
Yeah, I think that's very understandable. Using my metric of Letterboxd, this has a 2.1 average. Wow.
Exactly.
People did not like this movie all that much, and it sounds like I'm kind of in the consensus. I gave it 2.5 out of 5 Letterboxd. I don't love it either, but I am with you in the sense that I do think there are good things here. I don't love it. I think there's a lot about the movie that as it goes on, it becomes more suffocating in its exploitation.
It is repetitive. I think at 3 hours long, it does suffer from a sort of numbness that I don't know if that does the film any favors.
But I think in a microcosm, there are many scenes here where the craft is just undeniable. I think it's really well made. People have gone back and forth on Ana de Armas. I struggle to understand that debate. I think she's really great. It's the material around her that doesn't do her much justice.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think her performance is really good, but given the agenda, or at least potential agenda of the movie, it asks of her something that isn't necessarily all that complex, I guess, because there is a repetitive nature to that performance. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it can rank as one of the best performances of the year because there's a lot of repetitiveness and a lot of numbness to it. At the same time, she's good at what I think the movie is asking of her. So it's like this weird dichotomy.
I agree, because like if you watch the first half of the film all on its own, without the redundancy, there's really a lot to appreciate in terms of the craft.
It is a better movie, I will say.
The editing, there's some really clever and interesting editing at times. The camera work is, I think, really sharp. And the performance is really great. There's a couple of scenes where the camera just lingers on Ana de Armas, and you really see the character grappling with this desire to be a performer, and then everyone else struggling with what that performance actually is. And that conflict, I think, holds up really well in Ana de Armas. But then the redundancy factor comes in, and it does start to suffocate, which is why, again, I can't go as far as to say that this is like a 0 out of 5 stars. I think that's disingenuous. Is it now at the end of it, can you feel a certain anger or frustration with the film? By all means, absolutely. I do agree. I think there's a lot of justification in that. But I also personally can't just ignore that there are also good things here.
Right.
Which is why ultimately I'm in the middle.
That's why I included it on this list, which is to say, like, this movie is not going to be anywhere near my top 30 of the year.
Yeah, same.
But it's more of an acknowledgement that there are at least things that I still have to respect about it. And the same can be said about most other movies, too, that just because they could be offensive in their own way, does that mean that they are, at the very least, 99.9% bad movies? And maybe not. Sometimes there are good things to at least acknowledge.
I agree. All right, moving on to my number 3. This is a film that came out earlier in the year. The discourse wasn't bad necessarily. People weren't opposed to this movie as much as I felt like the conversation was more tepid than anything else. People weren't, they didn't find it the most ravishing thing they've ever seen. And it holds a steady medium 3.2 on Letterboxd. So, it's very much there in the middle. People aren't clamoring for it, but I have it ranked kind of high. I really like it. This is a film that is fighting for a spot there in my 11 through 20. I really like it a lot. And that is Steven Soderbergh's Kimmy that came out earlier in the year.
Yeah.
I love it. I think it is one of the best quote unquote pandemic movies we've seen yet. Although that is mostly in the backdrop, this is more of a Hitchcockian surveillance thriller that examines technology and privacy and paranoia, which is all very captivating. I love seeing how Soderbergh uses current events as a cipher for tackling those ideas. And as much as I appreciate Soderbergh's direction and the camera work, the editing of the film, I think is great. It's Soderbergh. He can do no wrong in that regard.
He can make an iPhone look so beautiful.
Absolutely. But Zoe Kravitz, I think, is really great here as well. It's not a performance that will end up in my top 5 for Best Actress, but I kind of want to invent a new category at the In Session Film Awards that is something along the lines of Best Performance that just lingers throughout the whole year. Because I do really like her, and she's not going to, like, it won't fit like Best Surprised. Who's going to be surprised that she's really great here? She's not a discovery. So there's not really a category where she fits for me at the In Session Film Awards, but it's a performance that has lingered throughout the year that I find really intricate and detailed and compelling in a movie that I think it has all those things as well. So this is a film that I'm against the grain in the sense that I don't find it in the middle. Like, I don't find it as this, it's just a little small Soderbergh film. I mean, whatever, which is, that's been most of the conversation is kind of meh. I'm much higher on it than meh. I think it's really good. So it's my number 3 here.
Yeah. I know that I'm a little bit less on this movie than you are. I still like it overall, but it is what I almost considered for this list. The only reason why I didn't is that I feel like it might fit the category of best overlooked movies of the year, as opposed to against
something. Yeah. That's certainly possible. Yeah.
Yeah, and at least I think the argument can be made for that, which is why I chose not to include it here, because we have our own category for that reason when we get to our In Session Film Awards, and maybe there's more space for it there. But I'm with you as far as the filmmaking and a lot of the other factors around it. I think it handles its budgetary and technical limitations in a way that is really efficient and really thrilling, and I like what Soderbergh is doing quite a bit.
I agree. Yeah.
Really
entertaining.
For my number 2, I'm going to keep the vitriol going.
Oh, God, here we go.
Now, this is a movie that, if we're going to go by the letterboxed criteria that you posed a few moments ago, I think this has a 3.7 on Letterboxd.
Okay.
So it's very high, but man, there has been a lot of antagonism against Aaron Aronofsky's The Whale.
Yeah. I was wondering if that was going to come up.
Well, I feel like if I'm structuring this more as against the discourse, I think you need to talk about this movie.
I agree. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I was trying to say earlier. I didn't want to give specific examples, or I couldn't think of anything off the cuff. But this is a really great example of, you look on Letterboxd and it's not really indicative of how vast the disparity is on social media. Those are it's almost two different animals at that point.
It's completely different. There are completely different conversations happening about this movie, which in a way is something I find, I guess, weirdly refreshing about it. And I know you and I are in the same camp on this one. I don't love this movie. I think it has problems from a narrative and, I guess, filmmaking standpoint. I think most of that comes from the overall lack of an adaptation process. It very much feels like a play that was just transitioned into film without any thought of turning that into a film-like format. But like we talked about on that episode when we reviewed it on, what was that, episode 513, 512, somewhere in that range? I forget the exact number, but it was in that realm. I feel like the film is offering a pretty interesting conversation about our progressive-minded culture and maybe how we overthink certain things as it relates to addiction, how we might, I guess, flag certain subjects just because they're ammo for a certain agenda, if that makes sense. And I don't want to say that the film is being misinterpreted by certain people. This film has offended some people, and I think I think that is a very fair response for it. But I also think the film is aware of that. I think it's at the very least trying to have a dialogue about our ideas on fat shaming and what it means to be physically unhealthy and how that might even correlate to the idea of addiction and whether or not that is still separate from that. Can it still be
that's the thing.
In the same conversation? So because there is a provocative nature to it, I respect the film a lot more than what it seems like most people do. And that's why I'm including it on this list. I think there are still some good things here. I think Brendan Fraser's very good. From a performance standpoint, there are some good things here. And I just respect the conversation that I feel like Aronofsky is trying to offer, even if it doesn't always work as a film.
Yeah, I completely agree. I did think of this as well. I have it listed here as an honorable mention. And it's interesting because the pick that I have here at my number 2, in terms of the average Letterboxd ranking, they're very, very close. Now, the film I ultimately chose for my number 2 is a movie that I think works much better as a movie, and it's one that I like much better, and that was ultimately the deciding factor. But if I was just strictly considering the discourse, then yeah, I'm much higher on The Whale than what is represented within the debate on social media. That's for sure, because a lot of people just straight up hate this movie with a capital H. I do not hate it. I think I gave this 3.5 stars on Letterboxd, so I'm like right there with
that's a good grade.
Average
That's a good grade. Yeah, that's basically the equivalent of a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. And while I understand the reservation with the film, I think it is very mean-spirited. I think much of the debate really comes down to how you interpret the not so subtle allegories of the film.
Yeah.
And maybe where you can relate with the film. For me, The Whale comes down to 2 things. One, the religious angle of what Fraser's character experiences, or what Charlie experiences in this movie. Not to the same degree, not with the same stakes, but a lot of what he experiences in terms of extreme religious hypocrisy is just something I relate with on a deeply spiritual level.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think because of that, I can push back the allegories of the film. Also, let's be honest, when has Aronofsky ever been subtle anyway?
He's not.
Always had these outrageous extreme ideas.
He is the most belligerent filmmaker working today.
Absolutely. You know, I loved Mother. And Mother is equally not subtle.
It's not.
It might be more ambitious and more overt than The Whale is. But in terms of that hypocrisy, there's just a relatability that I could not shake when I walked away from that movie. The other thing for me, and you noted, is the conversation around addiction. That to me I find fascinating because I don't know if I've seen much of that, but that's ultimately what The Whale is in many respects, is a movie about addiction.
Yep.
Something Aronofsky is obviously familiar with in terms of his movies.
Oh man, yeah, it's like, has he ever made a movie like Requiem for a Dream or something like that? I feel like he knows his stuff if that's the case.
He does. But this is a movie where you replace Charlie's addiction. In this instance, it just happens to be a food addiction, but you can replace it with anything, and the film works the exact same. And I mean, because that's what's driving so much of his choices here, and it's all rooted in this deep grief as a result of that religious hypocrisy. And I just find that really interesting. There's an angle on this film that you just don't see with other movies about addiction. I've never seen a movie like Shame, for example, or Requiem for a Dream, and people walked away going, I'm so offended so deeply offended by the sex and shame.
And to be fair, some people may have been, but
might have,
this is something we talked about when we reviewed the movie, JD, is that the underlying difference is that food is a common thing in all of our lives. It's something that's attainable for many of us.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not everybody, but for
Well,
enough.
food is something that we all
require.
Ingest. Yeah, we do it daily all the time. In terms of the addiction, yes, not everyone deals with it, but we all kind of deal with it. Many of us are dealing with the whole weight thing. So we can certainly.
I didn't say that.
Well, pointing the finger here. But see, my point is, a lot of us, again, not to the extremes of Charlie, but we can all kind of tap into that attainability. Whereas something, like a sex addiction or heroin, that's a thing that a lot of us haven't dealt with and we haven't seen up close. And
those are also vices that you can technically live without, I guess, in some ways, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can argue the necessities of certain things and what those vices could be, but we can't live without food. That's a fact.
Yeah, you physically cannot go without food. So he's always having to give in to that addiction at least a little bit just to survive, right? Yeah, I mean, you can go a long time without sex. You can go forever without doing hard drugs like heroin or whatever.
Exactly. But even so, there's a gratuitous nature to watching Charlie. That's Brendan Fraser's name, right?
Yes.
There's a gratuitousness to watching him devour a meatball sub or candy and things like that.
And sometimes struggle with it, right? Sometimes he makes the right choices and then gives in to it anyway.
But it's also gross. There is something repulsive about it. It kind of does make you a little bit nauseous. Is that really any different than watching the gratuitous nature of Michael Fassbender in Shame? Is that any more gratuitous than even the characters in Requiem for a Dream, which I feel is mostly a well-respected movie despite its subject matter?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it is
Trainspotting.
Well, yeah, exactly. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but I think this movie is trying to provoke those conversations.
I agree. I think ultimately, in terms of Charlie's addiction, I don't think Aronofsky is doing anything different in that regard. But the hornet's nest that's stirred up has been unlike anything I've ever seen regarding a movie like this. And I think a lot of it just kind of comes down to it's something that we all, if we haven't struggled with it personally, we've seen it up close, most likely, with our friends, family members, people, struggling with, their weight. Maybe not to the extremes of Charlie, but in a way, it's still something that's attainable. And because of that, it's really arisen this deep loathing response that I just find fascinating. I understand it, but
I understand it too. Kind of like my pick with Blonde. I understand the vitriol. I like the movie more than that negative response. I don't love this movie. Again, it's another one that's not even anywhere near my top 30, but I have a lot of respect for the conversations that it seems to be trying to stir.
I agree. And in that sense, that's why I have it listed here as an honorable mention for this top 3. All right, moving on to my number 2. So similarly to The Whale, this has an average rating of 3.6 on the good old Letterboxd.
Okay.
And similarly to Kimmy, this isn't a film where people are like, this movie is so bad. As much as nobody's talking about this movie. So in that sense, I feel the need to bring it up here. And, we recently talked about this on the main show. I think that was last week that we brought this up, but I'm going with the Oliver Hamanis film Living, starring Bill Nighy.
Oh, okay.
And I also feel compelled to have this on here because this is a remake of one of the best films of all time.
It did not deserve to be as good as it was.
Absolutely. And we live in a world full of sequels and reboots and remakes and requels and all kinds of nonsense. That's what Hollywood is spouting out a lot these days. And here comes a movie that is participating, following the currents down the stream. And not only is it doing that, but it's, as we noted, remaking one of the best movies of all time. I mean, touching Kurosawa I mean, to be fair, there's original source material that Kurosawa pulls for Akira as well. So there is that element of it, but there's no doubt that this is a remake of Akira because it is shot for shot very, very similar to what Kurosawa does.
Hey, I mean, so is A Fistful of Dollars. So is The Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, there's lots of examples. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because it is one of the best films of all time, speaking of Akira, I mean, this film could have easily have just been a very mediocre version of that.
No,
you know,
but it's very well made.
I'm not saying that Living comes anywhere close to Akira. I don't think that it does, but I think it is very good.
I agree.
I think it is one of the more under talked about. It's hard to say underrated because I don't know how many people have seen this yet. So if anything, it's underseen. Hopefully more people get a chance to watch it and to talk about it and to really digest this Bill Nighy performance because it is really good. And even though it does kind of echo Akira in terms of its storytelling, its rhythms, you know, the thematic undercurrent of it all. But as we talked about on the main show a few weeks ago, it does recontextualize this narrative a little bit as this is set in post-World War II Britain and the political, social element of that time, I think does offer a refreshing perspective on the same story here that does distinct it from Akira for sure. But maybe more than anything, because so much of it does have a familiarity to Akira, there's something about the DNA of this movie that is so sincere that it's still very moving. And there's almost like this giant respect it has for Akira and for this source material. And it just does it all with such genuine compassion and diligence that you still can't help but feel what this movie is going for. And Bill Nighy is a big reason
he's great.
You feel that as well. He's fantastic here.
Yeah, there's a word you use there that I think is the key difference, and that word is respect. Because from a narrative standpoint, there's not much that Living is doing differently than many of the countless Disney live-action remakes that we've been seeing. But the difference is, let's say you look at the 1994 version of The Lion King, and then you look at Jon Favreau's version. Does Jon Favreau's version have an ounce of respect for that animated counterpart? Not really.
No,
but that's the difference. In the case of Living, it is following Kurosawa's Akira sequence for sequence. Yet it still kind of feels like a different movie.
It does.
It has a different sensation to it despite giving you the same sensation. It's a weird thing, which is why it is an honorable mention of mine. The only reason why I didn't include it in my list is that I think the film has like a solid 80 on Metacritic, so
it's well reviewed. Yeah,
it really is.
Again, that was kind of the discoursey kind of angle of it for me.
Yeah, I think there's just a surprise factor as to why I almost included it. This is one of my biggest surprise movies of the year, given the fact that and I think because I'm potentially saving it for that category at our In Session Film Awards, I chose to exclude it here because this movie had no reason to be as good as it was, as sincere as it was. But I think that just goes to show how powerful and timeless the original story is. And I kind of respect that this film, Living specifically, doesn't really try to upend that.
I agree.
But it does so in a way that still makes it feel fresh, which I don't know how it did that. That almost sounds impossible when you say it out loud like that.
It is. No, I completely agree with you on that. And I'll just go ahead and spoil it because it is a nominee for me when we get to Best Surprise Movie at the In Session Film Awards. It's not going to win that category for me, which is another reason I felt okay to talk about it here more in-depthly than I will on that awards show.
Fair enough.
Still a nominee for me. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about it. I know it's been well reviewed, but again, it's one of those movies that I felt like isn't getting any conversation at all right now, except maybe Bill Nighy's getting a little talk for Best Actor. But beyond that, no one's really talking about Living. I don't know how much it's really getting seen right now. And so that's why, to me, I feel like I'm quote unquote against the grain a little bit because I am really high on this movie. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 on Letterboxd.
I did as
really
well.
love it.
I think the marketing has been a little weak.
It's been very weak. Yeah.
There hasn't been much of a push for it, and I think that's very unfortunate because Bill Nye, he does deserve to be in the conversation at the very least.
Yep.
All right, so for my number one, man, I'm curious if we have the same number one here. I'm going with the film that we just talked about on the main show. Damien Chazelle's Babylon, baby. Babylon.
It's got to be Babylon, right? There's no other movie for
this movie rocks. The more I'm
so
thinking
good.
about it, we talked about this at the end of that episode, JD, how sometimes we have these conversations where we start to like the film even more just based on what you and I saw in it. And that's not to discredit those who don't like the movie. I mean, we acknowledge that the movie trips over its ambitions all the time.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect movie by any means, but for 3 hours, I couldn't stop cackling. I couldn't stop cackling during this thing. And the more I think about it, I do think there are some hidden nuances here that we discussed that are pretty challenging, provocative, and pretty well thought out. So I'll let you talk about it a little bit further because it sounds like it's your number one as well. So we've got some crossover here. But I don't know, man. I the more I think about this, I think in the realm of Damien Chazelle's music/movie-based movies, I think this is my favorite. I really think it is.
I think that's very fair. Excuse me. I think there's an argument to be made that La La Land is a more seamless experience and perhaps even a better one.
It's more of a
because
movie than this one is, for sure.
But you gotta love, at least I really love the ambition of it. And I do think it is more thoughtfully interwoven than maybe it's getting credit for. I talked about on that review on episode 514, I believe it was, or 513, whatever the last show was.
I think it was 514. Yeah.
Math escapes me.
Can we stop numbering our podcast episodes going forward?
We might have to. We certainly might have to because I'm getting to that point where I can't keep up. I don't even remember anymore.
Yeah, seriously.
But I, as we talked about on that show, I think a lot of what we see on the surface regarding the debauchery and the mayhem, I think is working very purposefully as a cipher as the film dives into the ways in which Hollywood traps dreams of artistic ambition and necessitates assimilation onto them, especially those who are marginalized or want to maintain creative integrity, and how the film kind of divvies that out, how it explores those ideas through the mayhem of the film in our central characters, and where they all end up at the end of the film as Hollywood chews them up and spits them out with no regard whatsoever, I think is fascinating. The film is kind of bleak as a result, so I understand why not everyone's going to respond to the film. It is the anti-La La Land, as you noted on the show. It is Chazelle kind of grappling with that idea of how Hollywood it's turned what is supposed to be something beautiful regarding cinema, the power it holds over our lives, why we are captivated by cinema. This film wrestles with the idea of how Hollywood has somehow taken that, flipped it on its head, and turned it into this ugly process where it just has no regard for people whatsoever.
It's interesting. It basically takes this golden heroic thing of the power of cinema that we see in most movies about this subject, and basically given it like a Michael Myers mask or something like that, and turned it into a monster. And that's why I say, for those who simply see this movie as a quote-unquote love letter to cinema, you might want to watch it again. Now, that's certainly here. That love letter is still here. There are moments of optimism here that could be read into, but I think it's just as much a hate letter. I
think it's both. I very much think it's both. I mean, you can certainly talk about the love of cinema that Chazelle has when you look at it more metaphysically, I guess. When you look at the actual craft of the film, I mean, it is incredible. The cinematography, the set design, the costuming, the performances, the freaking score by Justin Hurwitz, which is so good.
Dude,
Like,
I'm looking at my bass guitar right now. I told you I learned Voodoo Mama on that bass, and I'm like tempted to just
you should
rip it out and start rocking it.
No, I mean, it is so good. Like, the craft of this movie alone speaks to how moving cinema is. That you cannot convince me just based off of the craft of this movie that Damien Chazelle isn't moved by the power of cinema. He absolutely is. You certainly sense that in La La Land. I think you very much sense that in First Man as well. An incredibly directed movie. And then in this film, he ups the ante a little bit by indulging in that same passion and love while also grappling with how feckless the industry can be at times. And how it's been throughout its whole history, especially in the early days and what we see there. I think it's doing very much both. And I think that's what I love about the final scene of the movie with Diego Calva, because it is that double-edged sword where he's watching a movie and is moved to tears because there is power in cinema. But on that same token, it's not an optimistic perspective necessarily as much as it is Manny reflecting on all these memories, what could have been, and having to deal with the fact that Hollywood does not want anything to do with him anymore. The love that he has for cinema, what was driving him as a person throughout the whole movie, that's no longer attainable to him.
Yeah, it's this notion that he was part of this mark that was left on the world as far as the evolution of cinema. He played a part in that, and he can take pride in that. But does anyone around him even know that he was a part of that? And that's where it becomes even more problematic. The more we talk about this, the more I do think the final scene is successfully having its cake and eat it too. It's so hard for any movie to do that, but I think this one weirdly does it very. This movie rules. This movie rules.
Good. It's so good. I do love it. Of course, we do talk about it quite extensively on this last week's show if you want to hear us talk about more. But yeah, it was the only number one movie I could have had for Against the Grain. People hate it. I understand. I love it. All right. With that, let's transition to, well, actually, must I forget? We shall not
honorable
forget.
Mentions, baby. Honorable mentions, baby.
Any honorable mentions that you have?
And a lot of these honorable mentions are a little bit hard to decipher because we mentioned this at the beginning, JD. I feel like we weren't all that against the grain on most movies this year, so I kind of feel like I'm, like, I guess, drawing straws in some way to find ones that I'm against the grain on, at least in some way. So the rest of these movies were mostly well-liked, despite me picking them here. But there are certain facets as to why I say I'm quote-unquote against the grain on them. So one of them is The Batman. Matt Reeves is The Batman, which is a very well-liked film, but the fact that I think it's better than any of the Christopher Nolan Batman films kind of makes me slightly against the grain on that, so I'm choosing that as an honorable mention for that specific reason. I'll also pick Avatar: The Way of Water because I think it's way better than its predecessor. So maybe I'm slightly slightly against the grain on that one for that reason. Jordan Peele's Nope, because the more I think about it, I think that's his best film. So maybe I'm against the grain in that way. I mean, most people really love the movie, but in the context of Jordan Peele's filmography, I guess I'm slightly against the grain in that regard. Turning Red, the Pixar film, I actually think is top 10 Pixar.
I was wondering if that one was going to be on your list. I know you've been really high on that movie.
Yeah, it's still top 20 for me as far as the year-end wrap-up is concerned.
Gotcha.
But it's still top 10 Pixar. It's back end of that top 10, but I do like it more than most people seem to, I guess, suggest based on Pixar's overall filmography. So I do like that one quite a bit. And the last one I have here is the Josephine Decker film, The Sky is Everywhere, which is not great, but there are things about it I liked a lot more than most people. From a filmmaking standpoint, I just kind of respected. So I'll at least give that one a little bit of leeway here when it comes to this topic. But that's all I have for honorable mentions.
Okay, so as far as a few honorable mentions for me, One that I thought about, but I wasn't exactly sure, maybe because I missed it in real time, where people really sat on the menu. I really like the menu a lot. I gave that 4 stars on Letterboxd. I think it's really great.
Okay.
I think most people seem to like it, but I wasn't sure to what degree, so I ended up leaving it as an honorable mention. But the more I think about the movie, the more I really like it as this fun, just work of entertainment. It does that film does not take itself seriously at all, and I think it's really good. Fire of Love, the documentary. So this is an interesting one because early on in the year, people raved about it, talked about it as one of the best docs of the year. I still maintain it's one of the best docs of the year.
And then where did it go?
But I feel like that momentum has really stifled quite a bit as we get to like year-end list and nominees for best documentary at all these awards groups. It does not carry the same steam as it once did, where I've been able to carry that love, that fiery love in my heart for
That's
that
gross.
movie.
That's gross.
So am I against the grain on it? Maybe in terms of, that timely discourse, maybe yes. So I kind of left that as an honorable mention here.
Okay.
One we'll talk about, Hirokazu Koreeda's Broker, for reasons that we somewhat talked about on this last week's show when we were kind of teasing what we're going to be doing on episode 515 coming up here soon, because Hirokazu Koreeda is a filmmaker that just doesn't really get talked about a whole lot. His films come and go without much discourse, but everything he does is great. Everything he does is gold. And then, Shoplifters is kind of like a Blue Moon film for him. Because it's the same thing. Like it's Koreeda doing what he does best, but for whatever reason, that one just hit the zeitgeist in a very different way than his other movies. Broker, though, is very good, and similarly to something like Living, although to be fair, Broker is still making the rounds here in the United States, so it hasn't had a chance to get everywhere yet. But even when it does, especially as award season is ramping up and people are watching, Top Gun Maverick and Everything Everywhere All at Once and Tar, Broker is still going to get lost in the shuffle. So as a result, I decided to have that here because I'm going to end up being higher on that than most people are. Then the last one, and this is kind of one that I actually wrestled with as far as putting on my list because it's one where people are talking about as one of the best international films of the year. And this is one where it just sadly didn't work for me. So it's kind of on the more negative side. But in terms of against the grain, it's regardless of which direction you go on the spectrum, this is one of the most against the grain movies of the year for me. And that's Davy Chow. I hope I'm pronouncing that. His new film, Return to Seoul. A lot of people talking about this movie as one of the best international films of the year. It is really well made, to be fair.
Okay.
It is really well made, but there's something about it that just doesn't work for me. It's one of those movies, though, that, kind of like to 2015, my journey with Mad Max Fury Road, it could end up being something along those same lines when I go to revisit this film, because there, in terms of structure, it's kind of like Tar and how it jumps around in terms of time. So there's these gaps that Davy Chow is trying to manage in terms of storytelling here. I don't think he's quite as effective. So that's something I'm also having to grapple with. It's also challenging in the sense that its central character of Freddy isn't all that compelling, or there's times where she's going to challenge you, which that isn't really my issue as much as I feel like her motivations are kind of baffling. There's an element to the performance that I really appreciate. I think Park Ji-min is fantastic in places. When the character is acting more introspectively and reflectively, which she is when she's trying to find her her biological parents, and she comes across her father, and there's an aspect to the character there where she's completely lost, which is understandable given the circumstances, and she can't understand the dialect of the people around her. And so there's this very fascinating, reflective, contemplative approach to her performance. Then there's other parts of the film where she is the complete opposite, and I have no idea why. Like, the film doesn't really give us any sort of indication as to what's driving that sudden shift, other than to suggest that she has this spontaneous personality. I don't know if that's enough to explain the choices that she makes ultimately in the end. So like there's a moment at the end that is supposed to be this heartbreaking, poignant. This is the climax of the movie that's heartbreaking. And I was so disengaged from it that it was very disappointing. And we're talking about me, the familial,
the one that wears his heart on his sleeve.
Yeah. And I struggled mightily to care. And a lot of it for me just comes down to motivation. Like, why does she react towards her father the way she does? Why does she react toward her mother the way that she does? And given what her mother and father do, you think it would be the opposite. Okay, so you're going to subvert expectations in that regard, but why? The film is ambiguous. And you know me, I love a good ambiguity. I don't think it's earned here, though. I think it's very contrived. At least it was for me on the first viewing.
I haven't seen the film to know for sure as far as how I would feel about it. But the difference here with movies like this that are trying to challenge people from an emotional standpoint is whether it makes sense for that character to raise those ambiguities up in the first place.
Yeah, and that's
the difference. Yeah, that could be the difference for a lot of people.
Yeah, because I'm very like. I don't need my protagonist to be likable all the time. That's not really my thing.
Yeah.
My issue is, okay, you're going to offer up this challenging, complex character, but make sense of the choices she makes and what's driving those choices. I don't think that's here at all. I think within the script, and perhaps some of it could be performance, but where they're putting ambiguity, I don't think the film earns that ambiguity.
Gotcha.
I think they put it in the wrong spaces. But there's interesting complexity here that I have to give the credit for. I understand why it's garnering the praise it has, why it's being talked about as one of the best international films of the year, but I don't know. It's just a little too manufactured for my taste. But when you see the structure of the film and you see that it's essentially doing what Tar does, but not nearly as crisp or sharp, it just makes what Todd Field does all the more incredible. Like, how did he do that? So anyway, that's my 2 cents on Return to Seoul. Unfortunately, I'm against the grain on it. But let's move on to our top 3 action scenes. Some really good scenes here to choose from, Brendan. Did you have any criteria for this list? What do you have at your number 3?
Not really. Really the only criteria, or at least, I guess, reasoning for this topic in the first place is that we saw a lot of spectacle this year. And that was kind of the reason why we chose to do this topic. We haven't done this topic every year, action scenes specifically, but sometimes a certain year offers a certain sense of movie-going spectacle that you just kind of want to focus on that as its own, I guess, topic. And that's why we chose to include it here. I guess if there is any criteria, I'm focusing on how visceral the sequences were as opposed to how action-packed the scenes were, which I feel like could be its own list. So some of my top 3 here might not be dubbed action scenes in the traditional sense, but they have components that are just so tangible and lived in, and you can almost smell them. You can, in a way, they're almost 3-dimensional without being in 3D. So for my number 3, I'm going to kick things off with the German war film All Quiet on the Western Front. So there's one scene that I feel like we always talk about when referencing the brutality of this movie, and that's the tank sequence, which is what I'm going with for my my number 3 pick at the very least. Again, not really an action scene in the sense of it being structured and edited like a traditional action sequence, but the way it's shot, the way it's conveyed, the way it's performed as a performance sequence, it's also very compelling. But seeing it on my couch on Netflix, I felt like my legs were being run over. It provided this quality that I haven't seen a World War I film do successfully. Yeah. Really any war film when you think about it. I haven't seen tanks characterized like this before. And then the way that sequence is also crystallized by an actual shot of a tank running over somebody, and you actually get a clear, visceral look at that. It's one of those moments of brutality that actually earns the gratuitousness of it because it sets up how dangerous that this tank character actually is. So the way that that's established and the way the brutality is handled is so compelling, especially because so many war films have done this. So many war films have tried to convey war in a brutal sense, and it can seem repetitive. But yet somehow Edward Berger's work here, it felt kind of fresh. So I wanted to include at least something from All Quiet on the Western Front, but this scene is the one that stuck out to me the most.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reveal this now. It is actually number 2 on my list, so we do share this. I just have it at number 2, but I'm completely with you. Although it's interesting you say that you've never seen tanks characterized like this before. I might push back against that slightly.
Okay, get furious right now.
I was going to say, maybe this is also ties into Against the Grain movies, because I feel like I'm way higher on Fury than most people. And
I like that movie as well.
Love that movie, and I think it characterizes tanks in a similar-ish fashion. And interestingly enough, there's a scene, one of the best scenes about Fury, reminds me of this tank moment in All Quiet on the Western Front. I'd be real curious. I don't know if Edward Berger has actually talked about this. I'd be curious if he was ever inspired by Fury in this way. Because one of the best scenes of all of 2014, I think, is what I dubbed the dinner scene in that movie. And it's this moment in Fury where there's all of this crazy action that leads up to this moment of peace where they get out of their tanks and they just relax for a moment. And they have some food and they find some women. And there's a sense of normalcy in the middle of extreme war that I think is so compelling in that movie. And All Quiet on the Western Front does a very similar thing, and it ties into that tank moment that you're talking about, because before the tanks come, our central characters, they charge the field into no man's land, and they get to the French side, and they come across this room with all of this food and wine and cheese and bread. I mean, they found utopia in the middle of this giant battle. They just got done killing
this giant
people.
Underground trench, this ugly location.
And so they pause. They go from stabbing someone in the chest in one moment, and the next moment drinking wine and eating bread. It is unbelievable, that juxtaposition, very reminiscent of that dinner scene in Fury. And then at the end of this brief moment of normalcy, if you can call it that, but certainly a reprieve from the battle, the whole thing starts shaking. The whole room starts shaking in a way that they have never experienced before. And they walk out to the trench and they see these things rolling. And you can tell that tank warfare was new at that time. They had never seen these things. Who knows? They might not have even been briefed on these things, the way they react to it. which is what is so fascinating about the performances, right? Because they're like, what in the heck?
To them, they probably thought it was a UFO or something like that.
They were transported to another planet. That's what you're seeing in their reactions there. And yeah, and then the tanks come, and it is so visceral and gut pounding. There's the editing of that whole sequence is incredible. But
it's one of the best edited films of the year.
Yeah, I agree. The edit of their reaction to seeing these things, quick cut to the tank, just demolishing a person. It is so incredibly difficult to watch. And there's something about the filmmaking that even though I felt it in Fury, I think it is so good here as well. Worthy of being talked about. Absolutely one of the best action scenes of the year.
Yep.
It's a far cry from the fun and the diverting nature of Avatar, The Way of the Water.
It really is.
But my God, is it really well made.
And to defend myself a little bit when I say I haven't seen tanks characterized in this way when a movie like Fury certainly exists, is that somehow Edward Berger creates this sense of mystery as if we as the audience have also never seen tanks before.
And that's fair. That is very fair. And that is also different than Fury, for sure.
There is something different. I mean, a movie like Fury certainly does characterize the weaponry of a tank. Yeah. Okay, if we're going to put it as
Fury the
bluntly.
Tank is its own character in that movie.
It really is. Yeah. In this case, the tanks are nameless, which adds a new level of fear to them because there's something so unknowing about them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you want me to keep going to my number
go
2
ahead,
then?
and then,
Because I know you still have your number 3 to get to.
Yeah, I'll get that. We'll just
we'll just
go to my
reverse
number 3 next.
We'll just reverse it up. Okay, that's not complicated at all.
Yeah, exactly.
And man, if we have even more crossover here, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
My number 2 is a film I almost considered for top 3 against the grain movies, but I realized maybe it qualifies more as an overlooked movie. But
okay.
I'm going with Robert Eggers' The Northman.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah, specifically the village raid that takes place maybe a third of the way.
Yeah,
through.
it's early on. Oh
it's
my
pretty
gosh,
early.
It's so
Yeah,
good.
You have at least a full third where our main character of Prince Amleth is portrayed by a young actor. I'm completely blanking on the young actor's name before we get Skarsgård coming in. But Skarsgård is introduced in this seemingly one-take sequence of this village raid.
Yeah.
And it just proves how awesome of a filmmaker Robert Eggers is.
Yeah, so good.
It really is. From a choreographic standpoint is why I chose to include it on this list. For those reasons, just the dirt of it, the fact that I was sitting in the theater watching that and not knowing at all how that was pulled off. And we see a lot of movies. Sometimes we can pinpoint the trickery, which is not a bad thing. But when you can't pinpoint the trickery, that's even more fun and exciting to see.
Yeah.
And in the case of this sequence, I could not pinpoint the fakery of it. It's so well choreographed that I'm almost astounded that Eggers is ready to disown this movie because it wasn't the vision that he had. I think the movie we still got rules. It absolutely rules.
Great. Yeah.
It's amazing. I think it's still one of the best directed films of the year, just given the technical precision of it. But this sequence, I think, is emblematic of all of those things. So as far as action sequences go that involve hand-to-hand combat, this is top of the list for me.
Man, I didn't know that Robert Eggers had said that. But I think this film is great.
I don't think he said those words specifically about quote-unquote disowning it, but he has been vocal that he's not happy with the final product because there has been studio interference. His version apparently was more ambiguous and more artful in a way that, let's say, a movie like The Lighthouse was or The Witch was. There was still a push for at least some accessibility by the studios here that he was not happy with. But I don't know. The final product is still very much a Robert Eggers film, if you ask me.
I agree, and I understand that. I'm sure directors all the time hate dealing with studio interference.
Well, these are their babies, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I understand it, but Robert Eggers, if you're somehow ever listening to this, The Northman is freaking awesome, and what you did with it is fantastic, not just in terms of its action, but it's characterization, what it's doing thematically, some of the storytelling choices that are made. It's great. It's got one of the better scores of the year that no one's really talking about as well. But I'm with you. I think that scene that you're talking about there as Amleth, I believe the Skarsgård character's name is.
Yes.
He he comes into this raid. Well, first of all, it starts off with him just outside the village, and he has that wolf thing on.
And he catches the spear like the most badass person you will ever encounter.
It is so good.
More badass than any like wrestler turned actor. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's great. And then the one take motion of it as he participates in the raid. It is really great. I have this as an honorable mention. This is probably my number 4, or I can maybe flip it out with the volcano action scene at the end of the film. I think is really great. Either one of those would probably be my number 4 here. Gotcha. Easily be my number 4, or the pseudo action sequence. I wish I could recall the exact verbiage, but that moment where he comes after the lord of this village, right? And he starts talking about how he's the vengeance of his father, and he starts barking at this other guy.
And I am his vengeance.
Unbelievable.
Perhaps our best ever clip setup that we've done on any review.
So good. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I could certainly have that here as well. As brief as that moment is, it is so good. I do love that. So yeah, plenty to choose from in The Northman. But it just misses out for me because at number 3, I had to include Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is
okay.
one of the most unique movies I've ever seen. In some ways, it's kind of disheartening that it's getting all of this awards love, because inevitably it's going to get the Oscars pushback in the discourse, which I am absolutely loathing. But in terms of action and drama and emotion, Everything Everywhere All at Once is this most singular, distinctive thing that we've seen, and I could not ignore it for that reason. Now, there's of course a couple of great action scenes to choose from here, but there's only one that I think there's one moment that resonates the most for me. Okay. And it is this action sequence of sorts that takes place near the end of the film where Michelle Yeoh's character is sort of fighting off these other characters that are coming after her, but she's not really fighting them at this point, right? She's had this epiphany that she doesn't have to harm other people, thanks to this incredible moment she has with her husband. For all of the conflict they've had throughout the movie, it comes to a point where he helps her realize that she doesn't have to harm other people, but she still needs to get to her daughter because she wants to rescue her daughter, right? And so as she's fighting through this stairwell to get to her daughter, these other people are attacking her, but she's fighting them off in these clever ways that actually pander to what they want from her. And it's pretty ironic. Inventive. It's ironic. It's really creative. And what's interesting to me about that action sequence is how there's the overt physical fighting, and this is where JD starts to lose it, is the internal the internal emotional fighting that she's doing at the same time, right? And this is where the editing of the film is really clever as well. And if All Quiet on the Western Front isn't the winner for best editing, it definitely goes to this one, because what's so fascinating about this moment is that she's fighting in the stairwell. They cut from that to these various sub narratives that we've seen throughout the film, such as Rakakuni, which is in and of itself absolutely hilarious, where she's helping him rescue the raccoon back, right? Or my favorite, the rock sequence. We get this really incredible, innovative sequence between a mother and a daughter as rocks. And symbolically, what do we get as a mother fighting for her daughter? The daughter rock tumbles down the cliff as to say, I'm done with this relationship. And what do the Daniels show is a mother tumbling over the hillside after her daughter. And it is, without hyperbole, the most moving scene of the year for me. Like that individual image.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's so good. Of a rock tumbling down the hillside is the most emotionally enthralling moment of the year.
Rocks are beautiful. Rocks are beautiful.
That is incredible. And how that is tied into this action sequence of her fighting for her daughter. I just think it is unbelievable how you get both sides of the physical and the internal, and it's expressed in a way we've just never seen before. And I hope the Oscars discourse does not destroy that movie, because that to me it's just unlike anything we've ever seen. And because of that, I could not ignore it for this list. So it has to be my number 3 here.
Man, you're making me rethink my top 3 right now for action scenes, because I barely even had Everything Everywhere All at Once as an honorable mention. And the reason why, I didn't know where to start with it. I mean, now, if we were doing our top 3 action movies of the year, then I could probably find room for it more easily.
Because there's a lot to choose from, for sure.
That's the thing. There's something so consistently unrelenting about the action of that movie. Really, all I had written here was any one of the fight sequences, but there are like thousands of them in the film. Yeah. So it just got so hard to find which one deserves to be on this list that I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. And it's interesting because I similarly wrestled with which one I wanted to choose from. Now, ultimately, for all the reasons I just laid out, I couldn't ignore the texture, the emotion, and the diverting nature of that.
The balancing of all that is just so expertly done.
100%. But there was another one that I wrestled with, and I actually thought about putting it in for comedic scenes, but then I was like, I don't know if I should have this film on there twice. But and I don't know how else to phrase this that isn't crass, but the butt plug fight sequence.
Yeah, I knew you were going to go with that. I thought about that too. I will say, you know, we're okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say real fast that though, if I had to just pick one shot, not a scene or an extended sequence, but one shot that is the funniest frame of the year.
That slow motion part.
Yeah, it's the slow motion guy.
The slow motion part of that quote unquote butt plug. So
yeah, that's blurred out. I love that.
I will say this is also another one of those movies that I couldn't even pick for my top 3 comedic scenes of the year, which we're about to get to. I'm just going to reveal this right now. Everything Everywhere All at Once is not even among that top 3 because I didn't know where to start. I could have thought about
have it as an honorable mention too.
Yeah, I have the whole movie as an honorable mention. So I'm glad I left it as an honorable mention because we at least get to talk about it in some way here for action scenes. I'm glad you got to choose it for your top 3. I can't wait to watch this one again. I need to see where it lands for the best of the year for me. It's really quite something. So I guess that leaves our number 1 picks.
Number
now.
1.
So, so I'm going to go to my number 1 here, and it's not. I mean, it is an action sequence, primarily because the way it's scored and the way it's filmed makes it feel like an action sequence. But on its face, it doesn't really feel like one, but the more I thought about it, this was my fist in the air moment of the year. And that's OJ's last ride in Nope. Jordan Peele's Nope. Yeah. Now, a lot of this is maybe due to Michael Abels' score. Is that Michael Abels? I think that's his name.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, but his score during that sequence is kind of what made me realize how much of a spectacle that this movie is, while also simultaneously saying spectacle is a bad thing. So we talk about a lot of movies having their cake and eating it too this year. Somehow Nope does that for its entire runtime. And especially in this sequence, by all of a sudden turning this movie into what was this thrilling horror sci-fi of sorts into some type of Spielbergian action / Western. I mean, this takes place in California, so it is a modern Western of sorts. But as OJ, played by Daniel Kaluuya, is riding on horseback there, being chased by the creature they've now dubbed Jean Jacket, and that score swells up by Michael Abels. That is a glorified, like, 1960s Western action sequence. And there's something about the way that it's scored, the way that it's shot, the way the camera moves from ground view to aerial view that I have yet to forget. It's one of those moments that in the theater I almost stood up. Simply because I had all this energy that I couldn't sit down. But this moment really did that for me, and it's that moment that made me realize this is why I like movies. This is a movie. This is a movie.
Capital M movie.
Capital M, capital O, capital V, capital I, capital E. But yeah, this moment, again, it's not really an action sequence, but the fact that it's not really an action sequence is kind of the point, which I think is really interesting about it.
I mean, it certainly has spectacle to it, and there are elements of action for sure. It's regardless of however you want to label it, it's one of the best directed scenes of the year.
Absolutely.
Hands down. And I do love this movie. I don't know if I love it as much as you do. I think I still prefer Get Out and all of its... That is one of the most masterfully written movies ever created. But for as smart and intelligent as that screenplay is, Peele's direction here is just monstrous. And I think that's a really great scene. It's certainly an honorable mention for me. If we were doing a top 5, probably my number 5, or maybe the quote unquote action sequence of, well, you know the one, the gobbling up moment. I'll just say if that was ever labeled as action, and it is a brief moment of action.
That's top 3 horror for me. If you
no, if we're doing horror, absolutely.
Oh my gosh, I'll never forget that either.
Yeah, really good movie though. That is a great scene. I do love that. For my number 1, this is going to be a little bit conventional sounding, but I want to articulate as best as I can why I think it's more than just a conventional pick. So at number 1 for me is Top Gun Maverick and the final action sequence we get at the end of the film. Now let me offer a little bit of context, at least my perspective on it, because I think what's happening there is way more than just Tom Cruise doing action spectacle. And from a cinematography perspective, it is quite great. There's a lot happening there, obviously very tangible. We know the filmmaking process. They shot a lot of that without using CG, and it's great. But I don't think that's what makes it so dramatically captivating, right? Now, articulate why it's so great, we have to go back to that original Top Gun. Now, one of the best things about Top Gun is its emotional undercurrent, which does not get talked about nearly enough. People talk about the beach scene, and who can blame them? You got half-naked guys that look great on the beach, or maybe some of the action in the air, the rivalry between Iceman and Maverick. All of that is really great. But the one thing that is so under-discussed is Maverick and where he comes from. What we find out through dialogue and actually through subtle writing, which I really do appreciate, is that Maverick has nobody. He has nobody. His mother by the time we catch up with him in that original Top Gun, his mother is no longer with him. His father was shot down in Vietnam. All he has, emotionally speaking, relationally speaking, is Goose. That's it. That's all we know. This is a character defined by death. And lo and behold, we all know what happens to Goose in that movie. A character already defined by death is even further defined by death, which offers up some interesting emotional stakes at the end of that movie. You circle that back to where we are now with Maverick and Top Gun Maverick, and that notion of death has lingered with him prominently and even further, because what else do we find out? Well, Rooster's mother, Goose's wife, has also died.
Yeah.
So the people that he is closest to, he keeps losing. So of course he is scared out of his mind for Rooster. Everything he does for Rooster circles back to not just Goose. It's not just Goose. It's everyone that is close to him. He has lost. And he's afraid that if he just gives Rooster what he wants, that he's going to lose another piece of himself, especially when Goose was the only thing he really had when he was going through Top Gun in that first movie.
Right.
All of that matters to the end of this film. All of it.
Well, it's about all those things.
It's about all those things.
It's a collage of those emotional moments. I mean, there is spectacle there for sure, but the spectacle is at the service of recapturing that loneliness that you're talking about, that sense of isolation. And, credit to Tom Cruise for being arguably the biggest movie star of all time at this point. How is someone as popular as him so good at playing isolated and lonely? I mean, there are many people who probably are, but you wouldn't think that. And the fact that he's able to convince you of that is so, is so crucial to his performance in the film.
I completely agree. It's interesting. I just did a podcast, a video with Brian Rowe, who writes for us at InSessionFilm.com. We were talking about the award season. I brought up Tom Cruise. There's been some talk about him. Could he land in Best Actor? And I talked specifically about his performance and that this is easily the best work we've seen from him in years. In a long time.
Since Magnolia?
Maybe. It's certainly possible that is the case.
I mean, there is Tropic Thunder, but that is such a different performance.
That's very different, and he's great in that, absolutely.
Yeah.
But in terms of, like vigorous emotional depth, we have not seen him like that in a really long time. And what I love so much about what he brings to the character in relation to all of that, and even in this film in itself, of course, it matters to what takes place there at the end. I think of that bar scene. We're going to talk about our top 5 scenes next week. I don't know if this will make my top 5, but it is very much in the conversation for me.
Oh, for sure.
That moment of him outside the bar, looking in as Rooster is playing the song that defined his father. And again, I love the subtlety of it because it is just a wide shot of the camera looking through the glass as he's looking into the door at Rooster. And you sense the emotion, you feel the emotion. And what is Tom Cruise doing? Nothing. He's not saying anything. He's not doing anything. It is him acting introspectively through that window. And it is incredible. Or you get to the moment with Iceman. I've compared this movie, his journey in this movie, to Manchester by the Sea because that's ultimately what it is. He gets his I can't beat it moment with Iceman when Iceman says, you need to let go of the past. And he regurgitates what Lee does in that movie. I can't beat it.
I can't
he doesn't
beat
say
it.
those words, but that's more or less what he says.
That's more or less what he's saying. You're right.
And again, it's not capital A acting. What the camera is doing there, it's a stationary camera on Tom Cruise. And Tom Cruise has to say so much without hardly saying anything at all. It is very
so hard. That's so
good.
hard to do. It's so hard to do.
It is. It's really, really great. And then, of course, the film uses those two scenes to build up conflict between him and Rooster. And with all the other context we find out, such as what happens with Goose's wife and Rooster's mom, all of that matters. And it all compounds itself to that final action sequence, and even what leads up to it, right? Because before they take off, you get that incredible singular moment there with Maverick, who lays out the iconic line, "Talk to me, Goose." Yeah. Incredible, followed up by, and I'm not going to be able to say it here without losing it, Rooster in the cockpit. "Talk to me, Dad." Oh boy.
We're in a video format right now. Your eyes look pretty glazed at the moment. I wonder why.
It is so good. It is absolutely...
Get rid of that bowl of onions that you have in front of you.
Exactly. It is absolutely one of the best single lines of the year. And to have those two characters have those individual moments then lead to this action beat where all of that emotion is cathartically laid out with each other, where, you know, Maverick has the sacrifice, and then Rooster comes in to save the day, and then they have to kind of get out all together, and then they have the final moment on the ship. None of that is earned without thinking about where Maverick has come from in the first movie and how this movie utilizes it to further heighten the emotional conflict of it all, especially for Maverick and even with Rooster. Miles Teller, one of the most underrated performances of the year.
Oh, he's great in it. He's very good in it. Well, because he has to recapture a lot of what was it, Anthony Edwards, who played Goose. Yes. You have to feel like you're watching someone that isn't just playing that character's son. You have to kind of believe that actually. Yeah, because I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that they kind of look alike. So maybe some of the credit has to go to the casting for the film. But I fully bought that. Oh, this is Goose's lineage right here.
I will not spoil as to how, but Miles Teller will be brought up and at the In-Session Film Awards. I can guarantee it.
For worst actor of the year. I love it. No, of course not. He is good. He's great.
So good. So yeah, I mean, again, I wanted to articulate that as much as I can because it's so easy to say Top Gun Maverick in action, and as far as the best of the year, of course.
But there are more layers going on.
But there is so much more texture to it beyond choreography, beyond cinematography, beyond the spectacle of it all. All of that is great, and it is last on the list for me. Absolutely at the bottom. None of that, like all of that is great, but that doesn't define that sequence by any stretch of the imagination. Right. It is all of those emotional layers working together, and that to me is the brilliance of that film, and why it's not just the best one of the best action scenes for me. I have it here at number one. Why it's one of the best films of the year. Period. Full stop.
This is proof how powerful and I guess intellectual this film actually is, because we just spent 10 to 15 minutes talking about this movie, and we spent our time talking about one scene.
Exactly. Yeah, or at least a lot of things leading up to that one moment for sure. All right,
but still, yeah. I mean, it shows how powerful the film is on its whole, for sure.
All right, yeah. We do have another top 3 to get to. I know we've been going a little long here, so let's quickly get through honorable mentions, and then we'll start the last session here.
Yeah, I feel like as far as action scenes, you have to at least acknowledge a few scenes from Avatar: The Way of Water, as well as Matt Reeves' The Batman. The car chase from The Batman is one I had singled out here, as well as the final act of Avatar: The Way of Water. I also have the car chase from Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. I have many of the combat scenes from Prey, a film I didn't love, but I think there's some good sequences there. I also have written here drone shots from Ambulance.
Oh, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, I love that. I love that pick. Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought about that as well. And if we're going to get a little creative with action scenes, I mean, let's go back to Damien Chazelle's Babylon. The way that the kinescope sequence is edited is kind of like an action sequence. So
I mean, there is an epic battle on display.
There is. I mean, can we spoil it? Someone dies on set.
Someone dies. Yeah. There's a whole orchestra involved and everything. It's great.
Yeah, so I guess that does qualify. Maybe that's in my top 5 now that I think about it. So anyway, I at least wanted to single that one out. And the last one I had here, as far as a bit of a out of the box pick, the basketball montages from Hustle. I think are edited in an action sequence kind of way.
I'll take that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just from the editing of it, I thought there's some good technical stuff happening here too.
All right, I'll be quick here with mine. Don't worry, RRR fans. I got you covered. It was very close to making this list for me as well, but rating the compound in RRR, very much an honorable mention. Maybe top 5 if we extend this out to a 5 there. Maybe that hits that 5th slot there. Certainly several others from RRR to consider, but
sure.
The animals raiding the compound, that's probably the most bombastic of them all. Or the bridge sequence, which begins one of the best sequences of the year. All of that is really great. Prey, the Batman, Avatar, The Way of Water, as you mentioned. I talked about the Northman earlier. I have all of that listed here. And then the last one I have, and this is maybe similar to your Nope argument, does the... I'll say the quote unquote action, that final act at the end of the Banshees of Inisherin, does that count as action?
I think that's a bit of a stretch. The spectacle isn't quite as comparable, if you ask me.
It's not, but there's some action going on there.
There is, and there's certainly a sense of excitement to that sequence as well that you're talking about. So it's not one I thought about. It's not one I thought about, but I think if you're going to try and have that argument, I mean, I love the film so much I can't really fight against it. So
fair enough. All right, let's get to comedic scenes. We'll end things here. What do you have for your number 3 comedic scene?
This was hard. First off, I'll say I did try to avoid movies for this list that were consistently comedic because that just made it so difficult, which is why a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once isn't in this top 3 because
it's so hard to choose.
I can almost pick the whole movie in reality. For my number 3, it's not really a scene, but it's sort of a reoccurring joke in a movie. But when it's first brought up, the reference to whale jet ski and Marcel the Shell with shoes on is one of the funniest things I heard all year.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, whale jet ski is a mispronunciation of the great Wayne Gretzky, the Canadian hockey player.
Love that.
But just it showcases the innocence of this character of Marcel, voiced by Jenny Slate. And so it's a comedic moment that's complementary to the film and establishing the innocence of this character while being just kind of brilliant in its own way. It's a play on words that doesn't always work in movies like this, but this one really does work. Whenever I heard that whale jet ski, I lost it. Absolutely lost it. That's my number 3.
That is a really, really great moment. Ironically, Marcel, it falls under the same camp for me as you were talking about there with Everything Everywhere All at Once. There is so much happening in that film that is so good.
It almost did for me, but for some reason, maybe it's just more of a subjective thing that hit my personal funny bone in a certain way.
It's great.
That one stuck out to me.
No, that is very good. So much of that film is really, really good. So for my number 3, and maybe this is a little bit ironic because I do think there's consistency to the comedy in this movie, but I did not expect that Tar would be as hilarious as it is. That is a really funny movie. And my number 3 has to be the accordion moment. Near the end of
I'll just cut you off. That's my number 2.
All right, so we could certainly share these picks then. I love this moment so much, and it is preceded by this moment where her neighbors across the hall are talking to her, and they end the conversation by asking her to keep the noise down because they're trying to sell the place, and her music is making too much noise. Lydia Tarr, this famous composer, God forbid, her music is throwing people off. And of course, that's what she's thinking. That's how she interprets this entire conversation. So as soon as the door closes, Todd Field, an incredible edit, just cuts to the camera looking into the hallway. Lydia Tarr comes around the corner just blaring this accordion, singing at the top of her lungs, completely out of tune. And it is so so good.
It's not even just that.
Incredible.
It's the lyricism of it. What is she saying? Like,
Yeah.
your sister's dead.
Yeah.
It is one of the meanest scenes of the year, and it is so gut-bustingly
good.
hilarious.
It is so funny.
And that's why it's my number 2, because it somehow, again, weirdly plays into the thematic trajectory of the movie and the complicated nature of this character, because in any other movie, you would just want to punch this character in the face. And while you kind of feel that urge while watching Cate Blanchett as Lydia Tarr, I don't know, it weirdly makes it more complicated because you know her history and her motivations, and given what she's going through, it sort of changes things a little bit.
Yeah.
The film is not afraid to ask those questions, and somehow this moment of depraved levity adds more complexity to it.
It is incredible. Yeah, I absolutely love it. The surprise factor is certainly part of it for me as well. The performance, the craft of it, but it is so... You're right. There's layers to it, and it's so funny. Really great.
Yeah.
My number 3. I guess since you just gave away your number 2, I'll just get to mine real fast. And I hate to bring back a film we've already discussed, but I have to talk about Babylon. Because one of the funniest moments of the year is the Nellie Leroy moment where she's trying to do her first talkie. And they have to do the same scene, not even the whole scene, just trying to get the beginning of it started like 50 times. And there is so much chaos to this moment. And you'll have to forgive me, I can't recall all of the characters' names off the cuff here. But obviously, you have Nellie walking into the scene. She has to find her mark, which in the first take or so, she stumbles on. But she finally gets to that. Then she has to go to a phone. But then there's so much happening. People are closing doors. People are coughing, sneezing. And this poor assistant director is losing his goddamn mind. Like, all over the place. Yelling at people. There's a guy in a hot box for reasons I'm not entirely sure of. But they have to keep him in there.
I think it's because the camera actually does create a certain noise that the microphone could
that's what
pick
it
up.
is.
Yeah, so the cinematographer is literally dying in a sauna right there.
Yeah. And the sound guy is going crazy. He's always cutting. Not even the director, the sound design guy who has the microphones is all like, cut. We can't use that take. And that happens incessantly throughout the scene. I love the subtle moment where I think it's the director is like, well, can we move the microphones over to here? Because Nellie wants this to be a mark. And he's like, yeah, we can do that. It's just going to take 90 minutes to set everything up. Do you think you have time for all that? And there's like this like snarky little comment that is so great. I love it. And there's just the energy and the pace of it is absolutely remarkable. It's one of those David Chazelle scenes where he's tapping into the mayhem of the early talkies for sure and the problems they would have encountered, while I think in this really interesting way tapping into those themes we talked about earlier as we see Nellie kind of progressing into this star that she eventually becomes. But it is gut-bustingly hilarious. One of the best scenes of the year. So my number 2 here. Yeah,
it's probably rounding out my top 5 if I were to extend it as such. And I think the reason why it didn't make my top 3 is because for how chaotic and unnerving that scene is, it is just as funny as it is frightening. It is so frightening at times, so unnerving that it's practically a horror film scene at times that I kind of started to create this war with myself. Does it even belong on a list of comedic scenes? Because the energy of it is so unrelenting, as you talked about that.
Yeah.
It got to a point while I was watching this that I almost felt like I had to pause the movie. It was so grating in a way that I really love. I love that about it.
Yeah.
It's funny in an uncomfortable way.
Yeah,
which
much
which I love about it. But man, it's horrifying. It's horrific because of the editing
and to your point, and I'll be vague here in case, although I'm sure we've spoiled some things already in this episode. But I mean, because you mentioned earlier that epic battle sequence, and what's so interesting or ironic about it is that it ends in a death. And here is another moment that is mostly very funny, unrelenting and unnerving in some ways, as you're talking about, but equally ends in a death. I won't say who.
And maybe
or how,
maybe
but
that's the thing. It kind of does recontextualize the scene a little bit, and maybe that's what left it off my list by a slight margin. But that again, that's not a knock on the scene. That's not a knock on the movie. But in the context of comedic scenes, I had to put some other ones above it. But man, just in general, this scene is, I think it's among some of Chazelle's best work as a director.
Well, and that's why, as we mentioned earlier, it is a bleak movie, and those deaths are not there by accident. It is all part of the dark comedy of the moment, and everything Chazelle is doing in the sequence that I'm talking about is all leading to that punchline. So it is absolutely part of the joke, but obviously a lot of that humor is pointing back to the mayhem of that time, the hypocrisy of Hollywood, and everything that film gets into. So, yeah, it's certainly part of it. But I mean, to your point, a little unnerving for sure.
Yeah, well,
but it's all very funny.
It is a nice transition to my number one pick, because my number one is yet another movie about movies from this year, a very different kind of movie. And it sort of begs the question, did Spielberg make one of his funniest movies this year?
I think so. So this is going to be interesting, because I also have The Fabelmans at number one. But do we share the same moment? That is the question here.
I weirdly think we don't. Actually, I don't know. We think a lot alike. We might have the same sequence. It's not the most obvious one.
Okay, so maybe it is different then. I feel like mine's obvious.
I feel like the most obvious one is the ending.
The ending... No, mine is not the ending.
Oh, okay. I always thought, at least my interpretation would be the director cameo.
The David Lynch sequence?
Yeah.
No, love that moment, but not my pick.
Are you going with the Jesus scene with Chloe East?
Hell yeah, I am.
That is easily the funniest scene of the year, man.
Jesus is sexy. I hope you know that.
I have never seen anything like this in a movie.
Me either.
And I rarely say that about anything. That feels like the worst type of hyperbole in our job, right? Like when we talk about movies, to say you've never seen something like this is it almost sounds like you're fishing for hyperbole. But this, I've never seen Jesus Christ depicted in this kind of comedic way in a movie before.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's interesting. We've talked about movies that could be polarizing. The Fabelmans has mostly been praised, right? And people are loving the movie.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that it hasn't been more polarizing because of that scene. Because my God, Spielberg does not hold back there at all.
He doesn't hold back, but maybe that's why it hasn't been polarizing, because it has been so, I guess, direct in that humor that it's so easy to respond to its comedic nature. And then the fact that our main character here of Stanley Fabelman, played by Gabriel LaBelle, is obviously a young Jewish boy. So the fact that a young Jewish character is communicating with someone that is saying things like Jesus is sexy, I think that just adds a level of irony that is so I don't want to say obvious, but it's clear what that scene's intent was. And on top of that, we are not talking about Chloe East enough as far as some of the best performances of the year, because I don't know how someone can sell that kind of dialogue and not make it cringy. There's nothing cringy about this. Interestingly, I didn't really laugh in the theater when I saw this, but my jaw was on the floor. And then I thought about it in retrospect, and then I couldn't stop laughing. It had this delayed reaction on me, which is it's almost unheard of. But this is I think far and away the funniest scene of the year.
I am completely with you, and it's interesting because we did a Spielberg series on the podcast earlier this year, and we talked a lot about his greatness, what makes him so wonderful. I don't know if we talked about the levity of his films as much. I don't know if that's what defines him.
I don't. It doesn't really define him. Yeah, it's not like his trope, if you want to call it that. But man, his movies, aside from 1941, but it's mostly his movies are very funny.
I agree. He can subtly slip in comedy without it, overtaking what is so great about, what defines all of his great movies. And similarly here, right? Because what do people talk about when it comes to The Fabelmans? It is the direction of it by Spielberg. It is the performances. It's the conflict of his parents' marriage and how that starts to dissolve, how Sammy reacts to that, how he copes of it through cinema. Like, that is the conversation, the humor of it. And I believe even our review of it was indicative of that, right? Because we got to the end of that conversation and we were like, oh, yeah, and this film is really funny, by the way.
Yeah. We had to save that for final thoughts. That's how much of an afterthought it felt like.
Exactly. But it is really good. He's so good at it kind of slipping those things in there without you maybe noticing as overtly as everything else. And here we are talking about it as the funniest scene of the year because it is. At least I think it is. And there is something, you're onto something there about Chloe East and her performance, because there's a naivete there with Monica that is actually kind of endearing and sincere. You do kind of believe that she has yet to experience the world. And also, but it also simultaneously taps into an ignorance that is so prominent in society at the same time.
Yeah.
So it kind of functions as a hilarious, biting commentary on how we as a culture, especially U.S. culture, views a figure like Jesus superficially. Oh, he was a cute Jew like you.
Well, this is exactly why the scene is actually funny, is that it does have that ignorance, that innocence, that naivete, whatever word you want to put on it. Because in most other movies that depict a scene like this, I feel like there would be some type of religious agenda to it. Or we would see the character who is saying these things as some type of villain, someone that we're not supposed to feel any sort of compassion for. But we do feel a sense of compassion for Monica because
I agree. Yeah.
I mean, she is a child after all, so that is certainly part of it. But there is a naivete that makes it really charming. And
exactly.
I think that's the thing. It's hard to find a scene like this in other movies that's also just as charming as it is biting. That balance is perfect.
100%. I completely agree. Spielberg, tonally, and to give credit to Chloe East, and I assume a collaboration between them.
Yeah.
Where they were able to thread that needle so perfectly that the scene does come off as this snarky, fun commentary on the misguided judgment, the American view of Jesus, if you will.
Right.
But simultaneously, there's an endearing, charming ignorance to the character that you just understand that she hasn't seen and experienced the world for what it is yet. And she's been taught these things. And so, it just comes off a little naively. She's a child, and she talks about him as that. And so, it comes off very, very funny. And, of course, there's the irony of her comparing Jesus to Sammy, at least aesthetically speaking, which is so absurd. But it's hilarious. It's so funny. Yeah. Then you have the Jesus shrine above her bed. And also hilarious because this is acting as a scene of romantic tension. We've been talking about the ironies of it and kind of what's leading up to that moment where the camera pans from the wall of guys there's like all those photos of celebrities
and actors. Yeah.
The camera then pans to her bed. You see the Jesus shrine, but before they could participate in anything, they have to say a prayer.
I know, but it's
so
also
awkward and hilarious.
It's also like the most like promiscuous photo of Jesus Christ.
Exactly. Yeah, that's 100% what it is.
It looks like a Photoshop model of Jesus Christ, which is sort of part of the joke. And a scene like this is working comedically when another scene later on works as an amazing callback to it. Yeah. So when I think it's when is it Sammy, right? Not Stanley. It's Sammy.
Sammy.
Yeah. When Sammy and Monica are going to prom together, and he's got a necklace of the cross, I think it is.
Yeah.
And she says, "Did you find Jesus too?" And I'm paraphrasing here. He says something like, "Yeah, the department store down the street or something."
so good. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, but I just like the way that it all builds on itself is really just quite clever. Yeah,
it is really, really good. Yeah, I laughed so hard at that scene, and I don't think I mentioned this in our review, Brendan, but I had an interesting experience with The Fabelmans because I first watched it at the Miami Jewish Film Festival.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so obviously there was a lot happening there culturally there before the movie and afterwards. And it was really interesting to be around that community, experiencing the film and taking it all in. Spielberg's sister was actually there to introduce the movie and talk about it a little bit.
Okay.
And hearing her perspective on it all was really fascinating. And yeah, their reaction to this scene is almost something I can't even articulate. It was
I wish I was there to see that.
It was the loudest I've experienced with the theater in a long time.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
It was really great. Yeah. So anyway, The Fabelmans is great, and that is one of the best scenes of the year. Any honorable mentions you have?
I'll keep this very quick, or at least I'll try to. I mentioned Everything Everywhere All at Once is basically the whole movie, but if I were to single out something, probably Raccacoonie would be my pick for my favorite comedic scene from it.
Yeah.
We just talked about Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery. If there's one scene or at least one moment that sticks out for me, it's the reveal of Kate Hudson's character not knowing what sweatshops are. Thinking that's where they make sweatpants.
Great honorable mention for me as well.
Yeah, so I thought about that. I mentioned Pixar's Turning Red not too long ago. The moment when our main character's mother shows up at school, I think is pretty funny. I mentioned Nope, Jordan Peele's Nope, not too long ago. The whole TMZ moment, I think, is really funny as well. Yeah.
And also the first iteration of Nope, when he walks around the corner there are like these... what he thinks he's seeing as aliens, and he's just nope.
The crystallization or revelation rather of that scene is quite hilarious because it certainly plays with our mystery box obsession going into a movie like this. So that's certainly part of the joke.
And that's coming. Like that joke is coming just because of the title Nope. And we all know what Jordan Peele is referencing with that title. Yeah. And it still hits so hard. Like they nail it. The execution is impeccable.
Absolutely. Let's see what else. Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. There are a few scenes we can pick from that.
movie.
I mean, everyone will talk about Ugly Sonic. But there's Gucci Dobby. There's Batman versus E.T. Some of the marketing for those made up properties I think is funny. I feel like not enough people talk about how funny Matt Reeves' The Batman actually is. I think there's actually a lot of humor there. The whole thumb drive reveal, I think, is quite hilarious. Let's see what else. Where do you start with a movie like Weird, the Al Yankovic story?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I another one I can probably say the whole movie. And I didn't love Triangle of Sadness, but I did find a lot of humor in that moment when one of our main characters is posing a photo of eating spaghetti only to find out that she's actually gluten-free and doesn't eat gluten. Yeah. Like there's a lot of irony to that. So there are many we can choose from, but those are the main ones I had listed here.
Yeah, I mean, that entire second act of Triangle, I think, is very funny in this absurd, over-the-top, way that Oslin does at times. I think it's kind of funny in the same way that The Menu is funny to me, because that's a film that similarly doesn't take itself seriously, as I mentioned earlier. A specific honorable mention for me would be that ending sequence, because the film tonally shifts to, okay, we've been goofy and silly and fun. Here's where we take things seriously, right here. This moment, the climax of the movie, is where we are going to take things seriously. That's what the tone feels like. And then Ray Fiennes starts talking about a dessert. And what he is saying is so hilarious.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah.
It is so good. And then you cut to the final shot, I'll just say, of a cheeseburger, and it is perfect. It is so good. I love it. A great honorable mention for me.
Certainly made me hungry.
Yeah, I mentioned Everything Everywhere All at Once earlier. Several scenes there to choose from. So we mentioned Tar. The ending to Tar, also very funny.
Oh, that qualifies for sure. Yeah.
So good. Love that. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the In Session Film Awards too, but I also love the irony that this whole film is about a conductor and this giant orchestra and all the music that we hear there. And then Todd Field in the end credits throws in a banger that is anything but orchestra. It is so good to me. I love it. So I thought that was very funny. The unbearable weight of massive talent, several scenes to choose from there as well. The drug sequence comes to mind, among many others.
Okay.
In Bros, the museum committee, whenever they're at that table talking, I could have seen a whole movie, 90 minutes of just that. It would have been great.
Yeah.
Love
that's a good
that.
pick. I totally forgot about Bros. I think that's another one of those movies that fell into that category of what do I pick from that movie because it's so consistently funny.
It's great.
But you're right. I think that one might be the standout as well for me.
Yeah, love that. You mentioned Weird Al, completely agree. Bardo, similarly, plenty there to choose from. White Noise has some great honorable mentions as well. I could keep going. I think for time, we'll go ahead and round things out there. We went a little long, perhaps longer than we anticipated, but man, there were so many good things to talk about.
We did 3 top 3 lists here, so the fact that our timestamp is still under 2 hours, it's not as terrible as it could have been.
I agree. Certainly do appreciate everyone tuning in, though. Of course, we would love to know your list. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything. Send us your top 3 against the grain, action scenes, comedic scenes. We would love to hear from you. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or Letterboxd. Email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. With that, as we round things out, Brennan, do you have any final thoughts?
Other than we're close at the end of the year, so of course with all the homework I need to do, I decided to show my fiance's nieces and nephew My Neighbor Totoro. That is how I use my time. I texted the whole group about this, but man, those girls loved it. They absolutely loved it. The young boy, the nephew, his name's Blazer. He's only 3 years old. He was scared to death of Totoro. He ran into the kitchen, hiding behind the counter, screaming, "I just want my Paw Patrol. Where's my Paw Patrol?" He was so scared, but I will not forget that moment. At least seeing the middle child, Emmy, she's only 5 years old.
Yeah.
She absolutely loves me, by the way. And I think she loved the movie because she knows I love it. Yeah. But she was on her knees, glued to the screen for all 90 minutes of that.
That's cool.
And it was the cutest thing I've seen almost all year, honestly.
I'm telling you, watching movies with young children, watching movies with Sam has been a blast. It's always fun to see how they're going to react to something.
Well, and especially when it's something you love, something that you know is still good, and it's not, another episode of Bluey or something,
which is great.
Like that.
Bluey's
which is great, but it's a very different kind of thing.
It
when
is
it's a Miyazaki film, for instance.
Exactly, because we don't have any relationship to Bluey, although it is great. But yeah, you're right. Like when Sam watched Star Wars, for example, and loved it, like that was a religious experience for me.
Sure.
So I totally get it. It is different in that way for sure.
Yeah.
All right, before we get out of here, I also want to say a big thank you to our patrons. Thank you for your support. Really do appreciate it. If you're a non-patron and you're listening to this after it goes to the public, thank you for listening, watching here. And if you want to sign up and get early access to all of these bonus content episodes, patreon.com/InSessionFilm. That's how you can find us there. You can sign up for as low as $1 a month, and you get early access to all of these bonus content episodes. So we really do appreciate you tuning in here. Everyone have a great New Year's, or if you're listening, watching this in 2023, I hope you had a great New Year's and survived okay. Mine is to be determined because my Michigan Wolverines play in the college football playoff on New Year's Eve.
Yep.
So I will most likely be drunk either way, but will it be celebratory or soul-crushing and depressing? Either way, I'll be drunk. So we'll see.
I guess that's the thing. If you're drunk either way, does it really make a difference?
I don't know if it does. Who knows? It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be at Dave & Buster's, of all places.
Oh, wow.
So,
that sounds adorable.
You know, again, playing games afterwards for fun, or are we getting killed and I have to go play games to get it off my mind?
Well, if
So
I know
who
you
knows?
spent all your money, then maybe there was more of a sadness there because you just needed to keep the drunken resurgence going.
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see how it all shakes out. But we do hope everyone has a New Year's or had a New Year's, depending on when you're tuning in here. And we will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Go Blue! Watch movies! Yay, movies!